here to continue our conversation on the motifs of atonement in Fleming Rutledge's The Crucifixion. Apologies that Todd and I were not available last week. As I have lamented before, I'm really bad at time zones, and for some reason I thought 7 p.m. Eastern time would just be 10 p.m. in Turkey. That was way off. And when I realized that no, actually, that would be 2 a.m., I was like, yeah, there's no way I can do that. And if I had logged in, all people would have heard was Todd snoring in our hotel room. So, but we're back, and Josh has a song for us.
All right.
I did think we were going to get Bob Marley's redemption songs.
I've already played that.
Well, that's a good second choice, Josh. Yeah. Speaking of which, Tony, so the motif in Fleming's book that we're going to talk about is ransom and redemption. But first, Josh asked us, Todd, for our quick takeaways on our pilgrimage through Asia Minor. And so, what surprised you, Reverend Littleton?
One thing that struck me, I guess they go together, is that, and I don't know where it came from, but the terrain was a bit of a surprise. As we were talking about it on the trip, amongst ourselves. It's like growing up seeing these images of these stories, these travels, or seeing a flat map, and you don't get the topography, and you just think, well, this is just a leisurely jaunt, and it wasn't fraught with traversing, mountains and climbing steep terrain up to a city, set on the top of a mountain, a flat top of a mountain. And so there was, it wasn't a leisure missionary journey, if you will. So not only traveling that road, not only was, there are always the reminder of the obstacles of people placed in the way of the gospel work that Paul was doing, but it was actually a costly. I mean, it was physical. There was a physicality to it, and so you could see not just the sacrifice of trial and conflict, but just the physicality involved in getting that message to the various places that we know the missionaries traveled. And the second was similar, but in the opposite direction of when we went to Israel, where in Israel you realize just how compact the stories were. I think we've talked about it before, how Capernaum, just seemed so small, if you will. It's a fishing village. It was small, not terribly populous, but standing in Laodicea or Ephesus, you realize, wow, this is a big place. Mm-hmm. There were lots of people, and so when you're walking away from the amphitheater, they're rehabbing, knowing that 50,000 people could fill that amphitheater. You realize, wow, there was a lot going on in this town, and then you realize that it was a port city. So a lot of ways to talk about the accessibility of the missionaries to move to and fro, and how the gospel could be heard and then carried by any convert in any direction. And so it's just the sheer kind of surprise that it wasn't just, small town in the Midwest sort of thing, but it was New York City, if you will, or it was Los Angeles, or it was Houston, Texas. It was just, those were a couple of things that really struck me in my first thoughts, just about what you see.
Yeah. I mean, for people to think, like in between Antioch and Ephesus is basically Colorado.
That's right.
That it looked like the Rocky Mountains, and so it's not easily traveled even by car. And so, yeah, the reminder of the terrain and how early and ancient Christianity was an urban movement, which I knew from book learning, but to have that visual evidence, I think was, and then I think relevant to our topic tonight, from the various basilicas in Constantinople, where the creeds were hammered out, in the 4th century on, to the churches carved out in Cappadocia by some of the church fathers, to some of the other churches in places like Ephesus. And I think it surprised me, thinking about the atonement, that we saw icons of the Trinity, the triune God eating with Abraham and Sarah. So we saw icons like that. We saw lots of icons of Madonna and Child. There were frescoes of Christ the Cosmic Judge, and even icons of Anastasis, Jesus rescuing the dead saints from Hades, and a few Byzantine crosses, but there were no crucifixions. And so it was a visual reminder from the Church of the Apostles, all the way up until the late patristic period. The image that we take to be the central event of the gospel stories was not prominent in the early church. And so it was just a reminder that the part of the story that we privilege has not always been so with some of our brothers and sisters across time. So with that, we're now going to talk about ransom and redemption. And so Tony, since my lay leader told me you did such a great job last week, I thought we'd start with you this week. Maybe
Oh,
you.
really? Okay. Well, let's see. I'll make two initial comments. One is just to remind us that Fleming's term here for all these things is motifs.
Mhm.
And that's a kind of it suggests a certain non-mechanistic approach. It's not it's elusive. It's as in ALLUSIVE. It's suggestive. It's poetic. It's so I think underneath all this is so much of American Christianity has turned the crucifixion into a kind of transactional proposition, propositional statement. And she's trying, I think, among other things, to just loosen us up a little bit and say, there's a lot of things flowing here and a lot of intertextual stuff between the Old Testament and what becomes the New, and just a depth of riches that you can kind of meditate upon in your mind. And so I think we tend to hear words like atonement, ransom, redemption, and we either go, I like that or I don't like that, and that's it. But she's trying to open it up a little bit more. And then I guess just a second comment is I was fascinated last week in terms of how she played with or explored the antipathy or the indifference or the whatever to sacrifice as a theme in our culture. In some ways, this one kind of turns the other side, because redemption stories are something we love in our culture, and what we love is first of all, what we love is the crash, the celebrity, the famous preacher, the well-known person who turns out to have awful stuff in their closet that somehow comes out. And then we love the redemption story. But this is a script up and down that plays commonly in American culture, I think. And Chuck Colson comes to mind as I think an authentic redemption story associated with Nixon, and really did awful things, and then went on to a change of heart and a really effective ministry. Other redemption stories are not quite as persuasive, but anyhow, it just struck me that those two things. One, she's trying to loosen us up and free our imaginations from a very mechanistic approach to the atonement. And two, that in some sense, redemption stories are very common in our culture. Whether they are like this redemption story or not is another question.
Yeah, I think that's yeah. And yeah. So for folks, I think, Tony, to your point, that Christians often talk in our culture about the cross and about the passion story in a sense that everything had to happen in exactly this way because of this motif or this theory or this Bible passage, as opposed to the Apostle Paul is confronted by the risen Christ, and that compels him to go back to the Bible and try to find ways that can account for the fact of this encounter. So it's not. So the Bible isn't this like Rubik's cube of motifs and passages that produce the cross. It's that the cross is a problem and is unimaginable until the fact of resurrection, and then the church goes back to the multi-layered treasure of Israel's scriptures and tries to find language to articulate what has happened. And so so their motifs and forms of speech. They're not.
It remains narrative as opposed to. There's not a chapter that says this is the meaning of the crucifixion.
Yeah. And I think, particularly with this motif, if you just let the language lift the luggage, it can be powerful, right? If you try to turn it into an explanation, then it all kind of falls apart.
Right.
But
right.
if you pick up this language from the Bible and proclaim it, it preaches.
Yes, that was one of her points early on, and right, yeah. And hey, Todd, I'm wondering, do you remember? You're the only other old guy here, and I'm even older than you. Do you remember when there were reward stamps, and you'd fill a little booklet with these things, and go to a redemption center and turn your booklet in and get a football or something like that?
Oh yeah, I do. They were S&H green stamps.
Yeah,
and you go to the grocery store, or you go to some retailers, and for whatever you bought, you'd be rewarded with these. And then they literally had books, and you fill these books with stamps, and you got a catalog, and you took it to the redemption center, as many books as you could turn in for, this is what I want. So you saved up for that thing that you wanted. Yeah.
Right. This was a primitive form of the rewards programs.
That's right.
But I was, thinking about it, fascinated. It was called the Redemption Center.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And it wasn't a Pentecostal church either.
No, I do.
Yeah.
I kind of tracking a little bit. I liked when you said to free us up from a mechanistic explanation. I liked her teasing out the idea of these motifs as, in this particular, as like a parable, and I think, because I'm always struck by those who are critical of, say, this particular motif, and actually use it as a whipping post for the overall narrative, and then eschew every other literal reading anywhere else.
Right.
And here she is really trying to, in a variety of ways, make or take pains to say that that's when the motif, or if you will, the analogy, breaks down, when you overly literally apply all the features of a redemption narrative or a redemption story to go to your point of I'm saving up these things to get them in exchange for that thing. And so I really appreciated that she gave a means to talk about this without having to feel like you've got to fill in every blank. And I think she also did that by making it an emphasis on the price.
Right.
I think that was a very good move to counter the critics who want to make of this particular motif the narrative of cosmic child abuse, to overplay the hand on a literal setting. I thought she did some really good things there that were helpful.
Yeah. I think you allude to a section on 287 that I think is worth maybe citing. The second full paragraph, she quotes a guy, Austin Parr, has a particularly good way of describing the way that biblical imagery functions. His term for biblical metaphors and motifs such as those of ransom and price is parable. Parr cites the same line in the Green Hill hymn, there is no other God, there is no other good enough to pay the price of sin. And then asks the imagery in these lines, and then asks if the imagery in these lines is literally true. Here is his answer. If you require a yes or no answer, you force me to vote for the negative. They are not true. But I shall vote with reluctance because the parable of the hopeless debtor redeemed by Christ's infinite generosity is an excellent parable. He explains that parables have gleams of truth, and the great merit of the parable is to convey passion or lay on moral color. When we break it down to a literal statement, the color fades and the passion evaporates.
Yeah, that was very good.
Yeah.
And a good example of that is in the next section. It's one of my favorite passages. She quotes 1 Peter chapter 1, 18 through 19.
Right.
You were ransomed not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Jesus Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. That's just a powerful passage.
It is. It is. It is.
And I was thinking, not just with ransom and redemption, but also with the motif of blood sacrifice. So often we put the focus on the expense to Christ. The pain suffered, the suffering endured, the cost to the Son. But what all these metaphors, these motifs, and like First Peter, what they're really getting at is how much God desires you, Tony.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, it's a puzzle as to why we revel in the suffering and the blood in that sense, a la Mel Gibson. I've forgotten the title of his movie of some time ago now, but it was just, it was kind of just all about that and in contrast to the Gospels that are quite restrained.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Josh, you've been quiet.
Yeah. I mean, you already said it's poetic language. It's filling out this moral color to describe who God is and how God is, right? That part of the idea of a ransom in the first place is taken up from in the Old Testament scriptures. We have this word, this idea of a goel, a kinsman redeemer, somebody who's going to come up after you, take up your burden, to care for you. And that language on its own is like a pointing finger, but it doesn't fill it out. It simply gestures to say that's not a bad picture of what God does in Christ by the power of the Spirit for us. He comes in search of us. He bears our burden. He pays the ultimate price in that he's willing to give all of himself to come in search of the lost sheep until he finds it.
Yeah. Yeah. Todd.
Um, I mean, I think that there's a few questions going on in the chat, and I think they play. I think they're addressed by Fleming again in a way that these should be viewed. These motifs, theories, should not be played so literally. And I think that's why I hadn't thought of the way she talks about price as an emphasis, but then from there she spends a good bit of time, as you just pointed out, going back to find out, well, like, so let's go back to the narrative and find out kind of how that language or imagery is used, and it's deliverance, it's rescue, it's and so the word we hear as redemption cannot hold up under the weight of that sort of picture, because in its literal sense, nothing was paid to Pharaoh to let Israel go. And so I think that when redemption becomes associated with that idea of deliverance and of rescue, it prompts us to look at the idea of redemption in a different way, so that we're not locked into the old, God had to pay Satan for our freedom. So
It does.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, it does become problematic, as she points out, if you try to make these motifs too literal, in the sense of like, well, like, why does God have to pay like, is the devil God? And so Troy's asking here, ransom is something you pay to a kidnapper, also a Mel Gibson movie, FYI. Most people don't feel that they are kidnapped. So speaking of paying their ransom may just produce a puzzlement. And I think Troy's right. But I think one of the things, that the church fathers in particular were wise in lifting up here with this understanding of ransom is that too often Christian language about the cross implies that God the Father has a really big problem with Tony, Josh, and Jason, and someone's got to pay for it, and so he makes Jesus suffer it instead. And by contrast, and that's certainly the sense you get, I think, in Mel Gibson's Passion movie. By his stripes we are healed is how the movie begins, right? But with the church fathers, they didn't see our sin as the problem so much as death and the devil. And maybe Troy doesn't go around his daily life thinking that he's in captivity to the devil. But I think if you widen the frame and look at the wider world, like, yeah, we are in captivity to something that is beyond our volition and good intentions. And what the church was trying to get at with this metaphor is that in some way, Jesus Christ's work, his life, his death, his resurrection, is the price by which we are set free from that, that we are redeemed from one master to another. And I think, yeah, if you put too much weight on that language, it falls apart. But I think it does speak to how we perceive ourselves in the world and the difference that Jesus makes.
Well, there's an old line, there's nothing worse than a metaphor that's done its work. And these are metaphors, and you can't push them too far. I was a little bit surprised, though, that she came back to, affirming you've got to hold on to the price aspect, and it was consistent with the theme she's been at, which is there's a cost to this. There's a cost. This costs God something.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness is costly. So we may not like the word price, or we may, I don't know, but the idea that this is a price is paid is not to be abandoned.
Yeah, but isn't her emphasis on that God was in Christ Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and so God Himself is the one who's doing the for us in such a way that we don't. I mean, I think we're forcing some sort of transaction on the metaphor or the parable that I don't know that I feel terribly comfortable making of that. So is that because we are not sure what to do with the price, or is it trying to adjust to her description, where she emphasizes it seems to anyway, emphasizes price over kind of a literal rendering of ransom? I mean, that's kind of what I saw her kind of, I don't know if it's a sleight of hand, it's necessarily, but it sure seemed to be that we talked about, this parable, this figure of speech, this motif, this metaphor, but she then went to retain, this emphasis on price, and the cost of it was, here's what God, the triune God, does. Jesus, she says, is the price. Also the Redeemer. So she's stacking these images on top of the one who gave Himself for us. So I don't know. I may have just muddied the water.
No. I tend to think of The Last Author. We went through the book Mystery of Christ, Robert Farrar Capon, and a repeated theme in Capon's work is that we are forever keeping score, right? We're always working the ledgers. And I think that, whenever somebody gives you a gift, what's one of the initial feelings that you feel? Obligation.
I owed you some. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
You can't just receive something for free. The scales have been put out of balance. And even though you're doing something nice, now what do I have to do for you? And I think where the poetic language gestures towards, this is who God is. God goes into hell to bring you out. We look at that and we go, oh, thank you. Now, what do you expect of me? Or we keep score with our fellow creatures, and we try to worry about who's in and who's out, and so we wonder if we've said the right thing or done enough to be worthy of the gift. And so that's where I think we get mixed up about price. Price is, grace was costly, and it's what God was willing to do for us, because that's who God is, and that's what God's like. But that same cost for us is something we can never pay. But damn it, we're always going to wrestle with it.
Yeah, she on 291, she says this: pushing the idea of price out of the picture in the interests of one theological agenda or another is a grave mistake that deprives us of the very heart of the gospel message, namely that God is involved in our deliverance. And if you skip down, she talks about the places where lutron is mentioned in Mark and Matthew, and somewhere about just past halfway in that last full paragraph, there are two implied contrasts that lend power to the Markan saying, that is, that to give his life as a ransom for many. There are two implied contrasts that lend power to the Markan saying. The first lies in the contradiction between the messianic figure from heaven and the coming down to be a ransom. The second is between the implied few and the explicitly identified many. The whole is a most startling statement, especially in its Markan context. The occasion for the saying is an embarrassing and childish display of jealousy among the disciples, two of whom, James and John, are seeking special privileges for themselves and consequently are the butt of the other disciples' understandable anger. And she goes on from there. So that's where I picked up that she's suggesting that you maintain the image of Christ, but for a particular reason, not to somehow revivify a literal description of ransom. She goes to emphasizing the price to emphasize who God is, what he's done, and the cost to God. That's what kind of left me kind of.
I think I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this, and I do think, we started talking about our trip to, the missionary locales, right, of the early church, Todd. That it's important, I think, to remember that the Apostle Paul and others ventured beyond Israel, not with any of these New Testament texts, but only with the message that Jesus was raised from the dead, right, and their Old Testament. So to put too much focus on any of the gospel narratives themselves is anachronistic. And instead, like, to put yourself in that, that if I asked Tony to explain the unexplainable, something that happened that upended all of his categories of holiness and goodness and the way that God functions. And I told Tony the only ways that he could communicate what had happened were with his Bible. Like, he couldn't, that, like, these are the only words that you can use. Like that, this is what like, that's what the church was doing. And I think that's what, like, to Cody's point, and even Mei Li, I think that's why so many of these motifs bleed together, that it's really hard to talk about them as discrete motifs, right? That ransom and redemption, apart from the Exodus, Passover, like, it really, like, the story starts to fall apart. That, yes, no ransom was paid to Pharaoh, but, like, these two motifs, like, have to go together for it to make sense. That we have been rescued from a power that is like Pharaoh, and who was that paid for? I don't know, but like, Jesus is this, the second person of the Trinity, like a gift exceeding every debt. So yeah, he's of enormous price. I don't know. Maybe that's just me ranting.
Well, one of the things that her emphasis on the not setting the Trinity against itself and God reconciling the world in Christ, in the cross of Christ, it kind of makes me wonder what if we said more often, God died on the cross.
Yeah.
Mm, right.
It, I think that, I mean, there's maybe two sides. I'm sure there's two sides to that. In the, Moltmann wrote a whole book about the crucified God, and he's not the first. But that overcomes the kind of the turning this into another transactional kind of thing, and we do tend to, we always tend to try to make sense of something that doesn't make sense to us by reference to past experience.
Mm-hmm.
And as Josh points out, an awful lot of the script that we operate out of is ledger keeping and debts and credits, and who's getting ahead and who's behind. And if that's all blown out of the water, then you've got to come back to these use of these terms, not through that lens, but through a different lens.
Troy says you may have a hard time selling some people on the concept of a God who can die. In one sentence, Troy has just summed up like all the creedal controversies of the first 1,000 years of the church. Like that's the nub of it.
Well, it's also why you've been in Islamic countries. Jesus is not God, but
Mhm.
he died. That death.
Yeah, Tony, I was thinking, that I think we tend to privilege Mark, Luke, and Matthew during Holy Week. That I think we which is odd because it's John's gospel, right? That is always assigned, but I think we tend to treat Jesus as like a passive victim.
Yeah.
That is like that's somehow necessary.
Yeah.
But if you read the Gospel of John, like Jesus is large and in charge from the very beginning.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a work of him with the Father and the Spirit. Like
Nobody takes my life from me.
yeah, it's like all over the place. Like it's
Yeah. Last year I did Lent and Holy Week all through John, and the John Passion story is amazing. It's so contemporary. It's such an assault on the ways that institutions cover their ass,
mhm.
and I mean, it's incredible, and I do think, yeah, clearly you're right. Jesus is in charge. He's not a victim. It is finished, and it, it's that's a very important. But in a culture that celebrates victims, I've heard a fair number of Good Friday sermons that kind of just go down that road, and he's our companion. He's of all the victims, without ever any triumph.
Or like think of all the like the Good Friday liturgies that just kind of read parts of the story, snuff out a candle, have the kind of somber, sedate mood of a funeral. But like if you read like the Gospel of John, like no, he's like kicking down the doors of hell and death. Like I think a Good Friday service in the spirit of John needs to have some sort of the energy of Easter to it, because he's the active agent.
Yeah.
The thing that scares the shit out of us too, though, is that John's gospel, Jesus is not a victim, but he also shows us what humanity is.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as we play the ledger keeping game, I can turn sacrifice into something heroic and think that again should make me worthy of the gift. But Jesus shows me not being a victim, but giving myself out of love and just laying down my life. And that I don't want to live into that picture of humanity. That goes against the grain of everything else that the world tells me how I'm going to make it. That's an incredible, that looks like powerlessness rather than power. And it's not power over, it's the power of attraction. It's the power of persuasion. It's love bleeding out rather than saying you will obey me.
And I think I was just thinking about this, Josh, that if you treat Jesus as the passive victim of humanity's sin and God's wrath, as we often do, you miss what Jesus is doing in the Passion, particularly in John, right? That confronted with a faithless people who say we have no king but Caesar, right? Just imagine living in a time when religious leaders say we have no king but Caesar. I know it's really hard for us to imagine that, but just imagine that. And
Caesar
but
should have a third term. That's all I'm
but on the cross, right? Like one of the things Jesus does is like, here is your mother, which is not him like, making sure his mom's going to be taken care of. It's like he's creating a new humanity, from this place of suffering and death. Like he's working, like he's creating an alternative society. So
Todd, when was the last time you used Lutron in a sermon?
If I had used the Greek word, they would have probably accused me of going charismatic.
Oh, really? Wow.
He's speaking in tongues.
Actually, you should just memorize some Greek phrases, Todd, and just like shout them out and see if people confuse it for glossolalia.
Hey, there have been plenty who've tried.
I'm trying to just looking through the notes here.
I wanted to, while you're looking, Jason, highlight a section on 294 that I thought was particularly powerful. This is about the middle of the page, bottom of the first full paragraph. Jesus's ghastly death was in some ineffable way commensurate with the enormity of sin and death. By submitting to these powers, he overcame them.
Mm-hmm.
In him, a power strong enough to deliver the entire human race has appeared. As the Epistle to the Hebrews repeatedly says, once for all. This is surely at the very heart of the gospel. I thought that was powerful. And then in the next paragraph, under who is paying, some Trinitarian considerations, she just has one kind of line. He's talking about this. He says, it all depends on who we think Jesus is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's crucial. And it kind of takes us back to the study of her Epiphany book more than a year ago, where she's talking about Christology and how Christology has fallen on hard times, particularly in the mainline churches. If you just think Jesus is a teacher and moral example, then that does interesting diminishing things, I think, to the crucifixion, to Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah, and near that last part of that paragraph, in Jesus it is the triune God himself who has intervened to reclaim, to buy back, if you will, his lost creation, and the price he pays is his own self in the person of the divine Son of Man.
Yeah.
Somebody brought up something from one of the comments on the screen. Then, did you guys see that? Just if I go to the chat, I'll see it.
It's Cody quoting Jensen. Although Christ suffers, he does not suffer the fact that he suffers, which is Jensen's way of dealing with the um, the problem of God dying on the cross.
Oh.
Um,
There's nothing left to do but party.
Back to Capon.
Hmm.
but I mean, like the passage you just read, you know, I think about so many of the sermons in the book of Acts are the same sermon, you know, and they're really, you know, like this Jesus whom you crucified, God gave him back. But it's, you know, that's the message, and then from that you can then, you know, as the homiletical wheel is turning, you can take stuff from the Old Testament and throw it on to give it skin and life. But it's, you know, shame on us for turning the good news into bad news.
In the comment thread, I see that hi Miley, writes, the resurrection is where our faith begins and we become aware of the gift we cannot ever repay in any other way but with gratitude and praise. That takes me back to a line in last week's chapter that I called out by T.F. Torrance, and kind of goes with what you said about your experience in Turkey with the Eastern Church. We are not saved by the atoning death of Christ, he writes, but by Christ himself.
Yeah.
And why has Western Christianity, I mean, just it's necessary, but not sufficient to emphasize the crucifixion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's even important for all the weight we put on the atonement in the West. It's important for lay people, especially, to realize, like, the word atonement is not a biblical word. It's an English word. And it's an English word that's been applied to various Greek and Hebrew words across scriptures. And so the sheer fact, the sheer attempt of trying to talk about the atonement is already an interpretive move.
Yeah.
Hence the expiation and propitiation.
Mm-hmm.
Just talking is an interpretive move.
What was that? Oh,
But yeah, and I think maybe I heard Chris Green say this recently. You know, that the problem with justification is you know, Paul does not believe that we are justified by nouns, but you know, but the name of Jesus Christ. So it's Jesus that sends Paul across this mountainous terrain that Todd was talking about before, and it's Jesus who makes us one with the Father, not motifs and not theories. These are just ways that the scriptures have given us to speak of him. Which is a good, yeah. So if the way you're talking about the cross sounds bad, it's probably not faithful, because Jesus is the one who saves us.
Right.
But
Yeah,
Yep.
if it's intended to induce shame and guilt, maybe something is wrong.
yeah. Well, we have no king but Jesus. So,
Yeah.
and with that,
Okay.
I bid you all a good night.
that's right.
Adieu.
Vaughn, chill.